Hi, in this exercise we'll have a look at files that have no owner based upon removal of a user. So in short, how do you find unowned files? We'll see why this is a very bad situation if you find them. Now, as you probably know, when you create a user, the user will be created in the password file, the shadow file and the group file. But also a login directory will be created, as well as a mail file with the user's name in var spool mail. And when the user creates a file or directory, in the inode properties, the user ID and the group ID of the user will be stored. And when you list the properties of the file or directory, the system will look for the user ID in the password file. And when it finds it, the system will display the username. However, if the user ID is not found in the password file, it will simply display the user ID and the group ID instead of the user name. So if you delete a user using userdel-r, it will remove the login directory of the user and the mail file in var spool mail. So you might think you've cleaned up the user nicely, but is that really the case? I mean, imagine the user had some administrative rights and tasks. So to, for example, create files in a shared directory for others to use. Are these files also deleted when you delete the user? Well, no. Any files outside of the user's login directory are not deleted automatically, except for the mail file, obviously. And if the user, for example, had created a cron job, the cron job will be stopped, but the user's cron will not be removed. So that's something to keep in mind. So let's just have a go at it. So first we create a user and we call it user1. Then we'll check the password file. So we see that the user ID is 1001, as is the group ID. Now we switch to that user using switch user or substitute user, whatever you like. So we run su-user1 and we touch file1. So we create a file and then we list the properties. And we see that user1 is the owner of the file. But user1 also creates a file in /tmp. Now let's imagine this can be any directory on the system that the user is allowed to write files to. And of course the user is also the owner of this second file. And now let's delete the user using userdel-r, and we check the password file and we see that the user is gone. And when we list the login directory, we see that file1 is gone, as is the home directory of the user. But what about /tmp? If we list that, we see that the user ID is no longer in the password file, so it simply shows us that the owner is 1001 and the group is also 1001. Now the tricky thing is that if you create another user, say for example user2, we see that since the first possible user to create is 1001, it will use that user ID. And you can imagine who's the owner of file 2 now. Exactly. User 2 is the owner of the file because of the user ID. And this is a very unwanted situation. So how can we prevent this? Let's first remove the new user. And now the situation is back to where we were. The file is not owned by anyone because there is no user with user ID 1001. It may have been another user that had user ID 1001 before user 1 was created. So the only option now is to check all audit logging and all other log files that might tell you something about the owner. So probably we should change our procedure when we delete a user. Now let's first find all files that belong to a user. So we create the user once more. So we add user1 and now we can find all files belonging to this user. And we could save this in a temporary file, but in this case we just run it only once and we see which files belong to user1. And now we're going to delete user1 once more. And now when we search for all files that have no user, and we see we've got a single unowned file, so it's up to us to decide what to do with this file. And we're done.